Welcome to the Expanding World podcast. I'm your host, Deborah Caldo. And welcome to another episode in this series on technology changing the future. In this episode, I'm talking to Siobhan Long from Enable Ireland. And obviously some of the things that Siobhan and I discuss are about her experiences at Enable Ireland. But really all of the issues that we talk about apply to wherever you live. Especially this idea that when it comes to something like independent living, which technology can actually support, the bar is set very, very low. And it's not an automatic starting point of discussion in terms of how people live their lives. And also, if you've listened to other episodes in the series, you've picked up some common themes already. And one of these is about the impact that the pandemic has had. And that's not to downplay the negatives, but there have been some fundamental changes in the way that we see work and the way that we interact with each other. And the changes that will bring, and has already brought, are going to be huge. And another common theme that I talk about with Siobhan is the fact that often the technology that's having the greatest impact is already available around us. It's on our phones. But enough from me, let's hear from Siobhan.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, for joining me today. Can you tell me a little bit about your background and your role at Enable Ireland?
So my name is Siobhan Long and I work with Enable Ireland in Dublin. We are a large disability service provider. We work to support children and adults with disabilities throughout their lifespan, really. But my particular role is that I manage our National Assistive Technology Training Service, because I've always believed that technology can play a really key role in enabling all of us to live the lives of our own choosing. And that's never been more evident than now, post-COVID, where we all found that without technology, we couldn't really communicate with the outside world. My background was as a speech and language therapist. So way back in the 90s, I began to see how there were new, albeit quite complex technologies emerging to support people who were nonverbal. And at that time, I was working a lot with children who were nonverbal. Since then, I'm really delighted to see how technology has moved on. Design has really become a central focus of the technologies that we often use now in Enable Ireland are actually not necessarily assistive technologies. They're mainstream technologies that have been built with universal design at their core, so they're accessible. And that's actually been a game changer. So I guess if you think about how we use our phones now for pretty much everything, so many apps are now intuitive and accessible in a way that they would never have been in the past. So it's a very exciting time, I think, to be working in this particular area and supporting people on their life journey, really, whether it's a young child in preschool who might need something very simple to assist them with developing their literacy, or it might be somebody in employment who needs text-to-speech software, for example, or needs magnification. The solutions out there are very vast and much more affordable than they used to be, if not free.
So what are some of the sort of apps, I guess, that you see people using on a daily basis that really have a massive impact?
If you think about your basic calendar on your phone, we're finding that more and more, people are finding personal organizers really helpful in terms of scheduling, keeping track as we all do. And I'm certainly finding I'm more increasingly reliant on my own schedulers. So personal organization apps are really very useful. I think basic built-in features like Immersive Reader, for example, in Microsoft Office 365, that will enable a person to have something read out on a website or on their phone, on the mobile version of that site, can really assist somebody to get the information that they want in a really timely way and not have to rely on a paid solution, but the solution is there built into the website itself. We also just see how built-in screen magnification on a phone, for example, or on a tablet device makes content accessible or makes signage on a road, for example, signage in a building accessible to somebody so that they can navigate their way through their environment. And then I think the other area where we're seeing huge shift really is in the whole area of smart home technologies. Time was when if you wanted to automate your home and, for example, open your doors, control your windows, your lights, your thermostat and so on, you had to really have a very deep pocket or have a funder who was very generous. Nowadays, those technologies have become much more affordable. Not only that, there's just again, because of good design and dropping costs, people understand and know about them now in a way that they didn't. So if you remember Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, as he talked about during the Iraq War. In my experience, assistive technology belonged in that unknown unknowns. People didn't know what they didn't know for so long. Whereas now, a lot more people know so much more about technology, or they have a family member who's particularly an early adopter and is using a Ring doorbell, for example, or is using some kind of a remote control for their home heating, just so that they can simply turn on the heating before they get home, or so on. That the word is reaching the people who can really benefit from these technologies. I think that's been a game changer. We've seen this during COVID. During COVID, there has been, I think, just a sea change in the speed at which technology is being adopted. And we've been lucky in Enable Ireland. We've had a fabulous relationship with Microsoft for many years, and they've been really supportive. They donated a lot of technologies to us, and we in turn were able to support a lot of people in their own homes with those technologies. And once people were up and running with certain baseline stuff, they were then really curious and wanting to adopt other solutions that would allow them to change the channel on the TV on their tablet device, or turn on and off the lights, or to check with a video intercom as to who was at the door. All of those simple things, none of them are really what you could call high tech anymore, but they have been the difference between a person, for example, living in either residential care or living at home with family, and perhaps considering moving into their own place or wanting to move into their own place. It's just been amazing and just so fantastic to work with people along that journey. And the last 3 years have certainly accelerated that journey for a lot of people that we work to support in Enable Ireland.
Do you see that actually having a massive impact on the way that we think about people living more independently and being able to use all this technology to support them? Because there's always that idea that people are vulnerable, and this is taking away that in some ways.
I'll be honest, I'd love to say that I think it's changing dramatically. I don't think that's the case. I think the changing attitudes are actually happening in the sector where older people are being supported. And I think because states, particularly in Western Europe, and in the United States, let's say, are really terrified of this growing demographic of older people, knowing that it's just not economically viable to support people, thankfully, in residential care, that people should be supported in their own homes. I'm seeing that that's where the shift is happening first. But I suppose what we're trying to do in Enable Ireland is to harness that shift in order for it to benefit people with disabilities as well. Right now, there's such an under-provision of supports at every level to people with disabilities, to adults with disabilities in Ireland, that if people want respite or, support around taking holidays, really, there's very little to support them. And supported or independent living options are really, really thin on the ground. We know with the addition of assistive and accessible technologies, they will play a huge role in enabling independence. They will also, for example, reduce and this is quite a sensitive topic to mention, Deborah, but I think it's an important one, reduce the need for the amount of human personal assistance that's available. Now, that's a double-edged sword, obviously, but, research tells us that time alone is actually a really important part of well-being. And historically, if a person with high support needs wanted to move into their own apartment or their own home, they had to have personal assistance package to match that was possibly up to 24/7 in terms of its duration. With the advent of these smart home technologies, like Alexa, for example, or Google Home, that enable a person to call on somebody when they need them, but not to have that person physically present all the time, that has the potential to be a real game changer. But there is a winning of hearts and minds that has to happen. And in Ireland, we're doing a lot of work around the development of an assistive technology passport, which would enable people to be at the centre of their own journey, to request support around assistive technology, get that assistive technology. Then the anonymised data from those passports would enable funders to be much more strategic in their decision making, because right now, we're not seeing any real systemic investment in technology for and with people with disabilities in Ireland. We don't have a functioning AT ecosystem. So we're really doing a lot of work to build a digital solution that will first and foremost benefit the user of the passport, but ultimately would really feed real-time data to the funders in an anonymized form so that that can then inform their decision making. And I think that has huge potential, but we've got a journey to go, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting what you say there. That it's a little bit of a controversial topic, because I think from my previous experience of talking to different people, the word that's sometimes been used is dignity. And often I think we don't put that first. We just think about support and care and making sure people are safe. But surely there has to be that dignity. And someone said to me it was dignity of risk, to be able
Yes.
to do things for yourself.
Absolutely. And I guess there's been a great shift away from, old medical and care models more towards a biopsychosocial model or a social model. And in Ireland, we've got an Assisted Decision Making Act that's just come through. We've been late to the party really legislatively, but I think all of these shifts will help to support the adoption of technology, to support that point you're making around dignity and about informed decision making and informed risk taking, which, we all need to be able to do in life. And life would be extremely boring if there was no risk.
Because you mentioned there that, and I would tend to agree with you, that a lot of the technology has come about because of this desire to help older people. Do you think that then and I'm guessing it's the sort of government and the funders of what services are offered, don't see that in the same way for people who have additional needs? Why aren't they seeing that as something viable for the young people like my daughter, for example?
I can only speak for the Irish context, Deborah, and in Ireland, the bar has been so low for so long. And essentially, the services that have been provided have centered around education, not necessarily at all really around supporting people to live the lives of their own choosing as adults, whether that be in terms of employment, although I think we've made good strides here around employment. But I think when it comes to independent living, we are so behind the curve. There are so few people, relatively, adults with disabilities who have that choice currently, that I don't think it's just even getting it in the past has been considered with any great seriousness, because it's kind of like, well, if the budget line item was never there and you're telling me we can provide it more cost effectively, well, it's still going from zero to something. Some people might see that as being very negative, and I don't want to take away from some of the great solutions that are available in this country, many of which really have been provided by specialist service providers and not by the state per se. Indirectly, they've been provided because they're funded largely by the state, these specialist providers. But it just seems that culturally, it's not in our psyche yet. It's not embedded in the way we think. And really, what's that down to? That's about rights and your point about dignity. But, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, Ireland was the last to ratify that. So we have been very, very slow to really step up. We're getting there. And I do think that, we're seeing a greater level of understanding among key players, politicians and senior personnel in our public health service, for example, around the role technology can play. But we have a long way to go. And, I don't see technology as a health issue. Technology should not be sitting within health. If I want to buy a laptop, I don't think about the laptop as being a health requirement for me. I see it as leisure, education, employment. Whereas somehow when it comes to disability, assistive technology and technology sits within a health space. And I would love to see it moving out of that health space ultimately. And I think that would also help the thinking around adoption and provision of smart technologies to enable people to live independently. And one thing I should mention, I think, because it's been a hugely positive experience over the last 3 years, when COVID struck and people with disabilities were constantly listening to themselves being described as vulnerable through media and so on. And, it was a really, really tough time for everybody. When it came to people who were using our services, we collaborated with them to develop a virtual service at that time. Now, we weren't alone in doing that by any means, but that experience has subsequently led to the part-time employment of 19 of those. They've chosen the term service owner, which is particular to Enable Ireland, as opposed to service user. So 19 of the service owners are now employed in part-time roles to design and deliver a virtual service on an ongoing basis. And what happened during that, I suppose, development of the virtual service was that people began to see technology in a different way, just as a means to an end, not an end in itself, not something that they had to sit down and do a computer course on, which is kind of how technology used to be introduced previously. And they began to see it as something that they could have ownership of and have agency over in a very meaningful way. And as a result of that, we've seen an awful lot more people across the lifespan, from people in their early 20s into their late 50s, embracing technology in ways that they themselves tell us they just wouldn't have conceived of previously. So when you start to take some control into your own hands, then technology takes on a whole different role then. And we're just really, I suppose, now wanting to make sure that we can sustain innovation like this into the future, because in many aspects of life, there is a certain expectation that people will be reverting to as you were pre-COVID. And that's not something that we want to do, because actually in our sector, like, I've been working in the field for a very long time, and I think the last 3.5 years have been probably the most exciting and the most innovative of the last 3 decades, particularly in the field of assistive technology.
Yeah, because there was lots of interesting commentary, wasn't there, in COVID in terms of talking about social isolation and how people with additional needs often felt because they were socially isolated. And
Yes.
suddenly there's now all these tools to stop you being socially isolated, because for the mainstream population, it became an issue. But I think there's still that need for human interaction as well, obviously. But I think that for some people, this is really your name of your organisation. It's enabled them to do more and have more control over their own daily lives.
Absolutely. And the whole remote working piece, again, as you rightly say, I don't think anybody wants to be stuck at home 5 days a week, but remote work was something that people with disabilities had been looking for years. And it was such a struggle. And now we see how effective we can be working remotely. And a lot more people are working remotely. And it's just put job opportunities within reach of people who previously had been excluded. So I think we really do need to hang on to these things and learn from them and take all the good stuff and amplify it.
What do you think needs to change? Is it a greater awareness of technology among people with additional needs? Is it a greater awareness of the impact technology can have on, let's say, the budget? What are some of the fundamentals that need to change?
Oh, it's such a big question. I think, yes, in Ireland, certainly the serious adoption of UNCRPD's fundamental principles, like personal assistance and AT, are the two sole supports that are actually named in the UNCRPD. So, they're named as absolute enablers. And, there's a need to greatly enhance the level of understanding and insight and education of our policymakers, of our public representatives, and of our senior administrators across all levels of government. There needs to be much more joined up thinking across government departments, so that no longer do people have to feel so siloed that when they leave secondary school, they have to start a whole new process to get the technology they need to go into college, or when they go from further education or college into employment, that they somehow have to sit in limbo, which of course immediately disadvantages them in the context of their peers and also in the context of their employer. So that idea that you just bring the technology you have with you is not something that happens automatically in Ireland, certainly, but it should, because if I have my phone, I'm not going to leave it at home when I go for a job interview. I'm going to bring it with me. So I think removing those barriers and simply just looking at a day in the life at different life stages for people would really help us to pull away the binds that are tying people currently and just clear the path so people can get on with their lives, get out of the way, essentially. So, I do think that's happening, but I think we still need to resource those steps properly. And Enable Ireland worked in collaboration with the Disability Federation of Ireland to research and publish a discussion paper, which is on our website, Assistive Technology for People with Disabilities and Older People. And in that document, we lined out a series of steps that we felt needed to be taken, the first of which is this idea of a cross-governmental agency to coordinate the delivery of supports for people across their lifespan. But there's a need to resource the provision of good information. Where do you go right now if you want to find out about assistive technology? Well, you search Google, of course, but there is no portal or place where you can reliably access information. It's a tough road for people. Then you've got to get your hands where you need it on some kind of service. Now, that service might be simply a chatbot on a website. It might be a helpline. It might be an online assessor who can do some remote assessment or advice with you, or it might be a full-blown multidisciplinary assessment for a very small proportion of people who need it. Right now, all we're doing, because we're kind of rooted still in the medical model in Ireland, is we're putting most of the energy into these multidisciplinary assessments, for which there are endless waiting lists and which cost a fortune, instead of providing a lot more of the generic supports that would enable people to get on with it. And the other key piece for me, I think, is that I think the government would be really well advised to provide a budget, a personal budget for individuals up to an agreed limit, which would enable them to get on with purchasing their own assistive technology. Because I think sitting on a waiting list while you wait for an expensive professional is really way outmoded. And the other thing I would say, and I come from a therapy background myself, a clinical background, a lot of therapists do not know technology and they're not natural technology advocates. Whereas I have met wonderful personal assistants, I've met wonderful bus drivers working in services who are just themselves intuitively connected with tech. And they, without even thinking about it, introduce technology to the people that they support. So we need to be much more flexible and pragmatic about how we provide these supports and not so clinical and hung up about who's providing them, as long as somebody can get them somewhere. So I think there's that kind of spectrum of supports. We call it an assistive technology ecosystem here in Ireland, and it's something that we really are working very, very hard to, I suppose, put the foundation stones in place.
Siobhan, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Deborah. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thanks for listening. Hopefully that gave you some insights into how Enable Ireland works, but also about how the way they are working towards making technology more readily available and the tangible positive impact that's having on the lives of the people they work with. In the next episode of the podcast, I'll be continuing my conversation with Enable Ireland, and this time talking to one of the service owners who's also involved in the Virtual Services project. So we'll be talking about that, but also about some of the technology that they use every day, which enables them to live independently. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd like to get in contact with me, I'd love to hear your feedback, any ideas for future series of the podcast, then you can email me, Deborah@expandingwealth.com, or you can find me online at Deborah Caldo.